Hi, this is Neutron from Behringer. It was recently updated to firmware version 2.0, and since I didn't review it yet, this is a good opportunity for a detailed overview, a look at what's new, a few tips and tricks, pros and cons, you know, the usual stuff. This tune was played using one of the new paraphonic modes in version 2.0. Let's get started. A brief overview, just for people who aren't familiar with Neutron. It has two multi-shape oscillators based on 3340 clone chips that feed into a resonant multi-mode high-pass, bandpass, and low-pass filter, which then goes ahead and feeds on into an overdrive circuit, into a VCA, into a delay circuit, and then finally output so you can hear it. It doesn't have a sequencer, arpeggiator, or any way to play notes, so you'll need to add that later on. I'll be using the key step for that here. Neutron is semi-modular, which means you can rewire and bypass its internal components using a quite extensive patch bay with 32 inputs and 24 outputs, and it works very well with external Eurorack gear. You can use it standalone or mount it in a Eurorack case if you like. Neutron also has an external input in the back and multiple inputs in the patch bay for various steps along the signal chain, so you can use its internal filter, drive, and delay to process external sounds as well. In terms of modulation, it has a multi-shape LFO, two envelopes, and a random sample and hold generator. It also has a few extra utilities thrown in, like a slew rate limiter, attenuators, a molt and a sine output, which can be assigned to a few sources like the mod wheel, velocity, or aftertouch. Bonus features include hard sync for the oscillators and a few interesting paraphonic modes, something I wish more multi-oscillator synths would have. Now, I want to play the oscillators for you because they're quite nice, but because of the default signal routing through Neutron, which goes through the overdrive circuit and then especially the delay circuit, which even though I have it turned all the way counterclockwise, which means it shouldn't be heard at all, you can still hear it a little bit and it makes the sound a little bit duller. So just so you can hear the purest tone possible, I'll patch the filter directly into the VCA and then take the output directly out of the VCA. So now we can hear Neutron's raw tone. Each of the two oscillators has 5 core shapes, and you can set them to either step through the shapes one by one or to gradually morph between them. I've got it set up here so oscillator 1 steps between the shapes and oscillator 2 morphs. The first 3 core shapes are sine, triangle, and saw. And then the next 2 have variable pulse width. Goes through 0, and then tone mod is actually quite nice. And then if I set the mix to oscillator 2, we can have a look at what it sounds like when they morph from one shape gradually into the other. Of course, we can set pulse width here as well. And by default, the LFO is connected through this knob, which isn't labeled, but it is. You gotta trust me on this one, into the pulse width. So you've got variable pulse width modulation. Each oscillator has 3 octave offsets you can choose from, and you can tune it up 12 semitones or down 12 semitones, and if you hit this one more time, you can go across the entire range. You can hard sync oscillator 1 to oscillator 2. Let's go for a broader range. And you've got paraphonic mode, which lets you play the oscillators paraphonically. More on this in a bit. A new feature with version 2.0 firmware is the companion control software. I'll cover it more in depth later, but a really nice touch they added here is the tuning display for each of the oscillators. This is useful for a number of things. The most basic thing is to tune the oscillators, either to intervals you want, or just to each other, to the same sound, to the same pitch. It helps with a little LFO trick where, let's say you want to connect the LFO to oscillator 1 and have it go up and down, say an octave. And for that, you need to take the LFO, pass it through an attenuator, and then take that attenuator and send it to the oscillator. And of course, set it to a square wave. So now if I just hear oscillator 1 and I start increasing the LFO amount, and if I want to hit exactly an octave or 2, right? So it's easy to pull that trick off if there's a built-in tuner. So a really nice oscillator section. The only bad thing or con that I can say about it is that there are no separate fine-tune frequency control knobs for each of the oscillators. It's a bit hard to be precise with these coarse knobs. And also they're quite big, so every time you reach out for the oscillator mix knob, you have to be careful not to touch them. But it's actually quite easy to take the knobs out and replace them with other ones. So doing something like this is super simple. And yeah, it will give it a new look. You might want to do it to both, but a really nice way to avoid the problem of mistakenly touching these guys. So let's talk a bit about the duophonic mode, because I think that's one of the things that is outstanding about Neutron, and I wish all synth manufacturers that made multi-oscillator synths would learn from this. Paraphonic mode, or really duophonic, because there are only 2 oscillators here, lets you play 2 different pitches, one for each oscillator with different notes on the keyboard. They'll still share the same VCA, VCF, drive, and delay, but I think this feature really opens up what you can do with the synth creatively. Now, there are actually 3 different paraphonic modes here. The first, the default mode, is a little bit tricky to get sounding right because the default is that Neutron uses last note priority. And it doesn't sound quite right because each note gets a different oscillator. But if you go into the control software, and there's a shortcut for this as well, and set no priority to, let's say, low, then it sounds much better. Now this note priority option is also new for version 2.0, and it makes playing paraphonically super simple and easy. Now there's actually a second paraphonic mode, or paraphonic way of playing, which is splitting up the keyboard at a certain spot, so you can choose a note, and then all notes played to the left of that pitch will be sent to oscillator 1, and all notes to the right of that pitch will be sent to oscillator 2. And then a third paraphonic mode, which is also quite nice, lets you freeze oscillator 2 at one pitch and then just play the other one. Now you can enable or disable oscillator 2 key tracking using the on-screen interface, but because this is a nice performance feature, you might want to use the panel for it. Now, due to the fact that it's a new feature, the shortcut for disabling oscillator 2 key tracking isn't written on the panel. The way you enter this mode is by holding oscillator 2 range for a bit, and then you toggle it by hitting key track and turning it off. So let's say that I wanted to freeze oscillator 2 on C. I would hold this, and now it's going to stay there, and I can still play with oscillator 1. Then if I wanted to freeze it on, let's say, B flat, now it's frozen here. And then F, right? Freeze it. And then freeze it. So it seems cumbersome. You get used to it. You could map a pedal to send the MIDI message to freeze it as well. So this lets you set a drone node to play with one hand, and then you have the other hand free to either change parameters or go get coffee or something. So those are 3 really nice paraphonic modes, and I wish more manufacturers would adopt this. Okay, let's move on to the filter. Neutron's filter is a 12 dB per octave multi-mode filter with low pass, high pass, and bandpass options. It has resonance, of course. Which will self-oscillate. And it pulls off a nice trick. If you look at the patch bay, you'll see that there are two VCF outputs. VCF1 outputs whatever is displayed over here, and VCF2 is an output of the next filter in line. So if you're in low pass mode, it will output high pass and so on. Now, a couple of interesting things you could do that. The first is to sum up, say, a low pass and a high pass filter using the patch bay, and I'll plug back into the output and then take that sum and feed it back into the VCA, let's say. And now if I turn the resonance down, I have a notch filter. And if I bring it up, it's a way to get a peak running across all your frequencies. Now it's very subtle because of the mix, but it's there if you want it. Another interesting trick would be to take these two outputs and plug them into your left and right speakers. It sort of can be like a poor man's stereo filter. It's an interesting experience, you can try it. Not quite like a stereo filter, but gives you an idea of what's possible. There are two default routings for the filter frequency. One is the LFO, and it goes through the mod depth. And then the second is the filter envelope. Right, which can get quite snappy. This is how you make a nice kick. Now the LFO is routed to this mod depth through the frequency mod input, and you can plug anything else in here and have this control the depth of that modulation. So while we're talking about modulation, let's take a deeper look into the onboard modulators. Now the LFO is quite interesting, especially with the updates in firmware 2.0. Let me show you what I mean. I'll take the LFO, plug it through an attenuator into the pitch of oscillator 1, just to make it easier to hear. So you've got the 5 basic LFO shapes. Right. Sine, triangle, ramp down, square, and ramp up. But by changing the settings either with a shortcut on the panel or in the control software, you can turn on blend mode, and then the LFO will blend between these shapes. So you could do some pretty interesting things with this. Now I'll take the LFO and map it to the filter. It's mapped like this by default, controlled by this knob. And you can go into the control software and change any of the steps, or all the steps if you like, to any shape you like. So here I'll go to an extreme and set them all to square, but I'll set them to different offsets, different phase offsets. You can do that as well. Let's say do this and then go here. So now I've got a simple square wave here, but I can morph between square wave shapes as I turn this knob to get really interesting rhythmic ideas and options. I think this was my favorite. Right? Pretty nice. So those are just a few patching, modulation, and settings ideas for the new LFO features in firmware 2.0. While we're here, you can set the LFO to start to sync to a key every time you press it. You've got a one-shot mode if you want it to just run once, and you can set the LFO depth here, and again with the panel shortcut, so you don't need to run it through an attenuator. The LFO is digital, by the way, which means that it can be synced to MIDI. While we're on the topic of modulation, you've got two ADSR envelopes, one routed by default to the VCA and another routed to the filter like we saw before. They both have outputs in the patch bay, so you can route them anywhere else. And another interesting modulation source on the panel is sample and hold. I'll patch that into oscillator 1 just so we can hear it more clearly. This basically sends a random signal, random voltage, right, out to oscillator pitch in this case. And you can also set glide between those levels to make the transitions gradual. So those are a few interesting mod sources. Let's move on to the overdrive section. I've still got my LFO pattern using the internal routing from the LFO to frequency mod. So tone changes the tone of the sound, obviously. And then drive will distort the sound quite nicely. Just to give you a little bit better idea of what tone does, I'll take noise and plug that into the overdrive circuit. So I'm bypassing the filter now. And you can see tone is basically like a low pass to high pass filter. So continuing along the signal chain, let's talk about the delay. The delay section is an analog bucket brigade style delay. You've got control over the number of repeats from this to this, and you can get feedback as well. And you've got time control. Can get all the way to a nice ringing chorus, especially if you modulate this. So several low double-digit milliseconds, and all the way to over half a second. Right? So a nice delay, like I mentioned before. The only thing is it does cut out a lot of the high end. Let's move on. The next new thing in version 2.0 is this companion control software, both for Mac and for PC. It's quite comprehensive and it's bidirectional, which means it reflects back on the screen whatever's going on in your Neutron. I won't cover all the features here. There's oscillator glide, which puts in a little pitch bend before every note, either up or down. You've got a few modulation sources you can apply to the filter, and you can set the depth of that here. So for example, if I wanted aftertouch to move the filter, let's say 50% of the mod depth. So it's quite easy to do. And there's access to a few other options here, like polychaining a few neutrons if you want, muting certain Q ranges. And if you've messed things up too much, you can just restore all the settings to the default. Okay, let's move on to the patch bay. This is probably one of the most extensive ones out there. It's organized by inputs on the left and outputs on the right. And Behringer have nicely followed the lead of others and put the patch bay to the right, so cables don't interfere with whatever you're doing here. And aside from access to a lot of the different parameters on the panel, you've got a few utilities like attenuators, an inverter, two sum mixers, and a multisplit. So that's the patch bay. Overall, the build of Neutron feels really good. It feels solid. The knobs are solid and don't wiggle. Regarding color, if you don't like it, there are quite a few overlay options out there which only take a few minutes to install, and I think a good reason to get an overlay wouldn't be just to change the color, but rather to have the various shift functions labeled, which there are quite a few of, especially since version 2.0. Just make sure you get an overlay that includes the 2.0 shortcuts. Let's take a quick look at the back. Aside from power input, there's an on-off switch, which is always nice to have. MIDI through on the back. Remember, MIDI in is up here up front. Dip switches for setting the MIDI channel, USB for MIDI in and out, headphones with level, line output, and external input for processing audio in the Neutron. Okay, let's talk about pros and cons. On the pros side, the oscillators sound great and the duophonic modes are fantastic. There are plenty of patch bay options, and Neutron's price is hard to beat. Morphing wave shapes on the oscillators and LFO are a nice touch, and the overdrive and delay circuits are nice additions. On the cons side, let's first talk about a few basics. Neutron doesn't have a sequencer or arpeggiator, so factor that into the price. And while the control software is comprehensive, there's no MIDI control over the various parameters and no way to save presets. Now that's somewhat expected in an analog synth, especially with a patch bay, but there are analog synths out there that can save presets. The delay circuit is nice and functional, but I've heard better, and it tends to cut off high frequencies rather aggressively, and the oscillator frequency controls would have benefited from a fine-tune function. And there are quite a few shift functions, which is a very good thing, but not having them labeled makes them hard to remember. That said, like I said before, the companion software or an overlay with the shortcuts is a good solution for that. So bottom line, Neutron is a great sounding synth at a good price with a lot of interesting features, and is a great way for beginners to experience hands-on synthesis, and a nice way to complement or start a Eurorack setup. You can find quite a few more patching ideas in my book, available to people who support this channel on Patreon, and if you want to make sure you don't miss more videos like this, hit the notification bell after you hit subscribe, hit like if this video was useful, and thanks very much for watching.